Judge recognizes childhood friend on trial. What happens next will shock everyone. It begins, as the most haunting stories often do, in silence. A courtroom, a gavel, a judge expecting just another case. But behind those solemn robes and well-practiced impartiality lies a past that cannot stay buried. When Judge Eleanor Hayes locks eyes with the accused, she's no longer presiding over a stranger. She's staring into the face of James Anderson, her childhood best friend, now shackled and accused of a crime that threatens to erase him from the world. What follows is not just a legal drama, it is an unflinching examination of race, memory, privilege, and betrayal. Over 20 key moments, this story will unfold like a slow-burning fire, each spark revealing the rot in a system designed not to protect, but to condemn. As you listen, ask yourself, what would you do if justice demanded you betray everything you thought you knew? This is not just a story. This is a reckoning. For over a century, the greatest stories have not just entertained. They've exposed, transformed, and reminded us of the truths we dare not speak aloud. At A1 Storyteller, we don't simply tell tales. We resurrect the moments history tried to bury and breathe life into voices that were silenced. Today, we bring you a story that will shake the foundation of what you believe justice looks like. It's not fiction. It's not fantasy. It's a mirror held to our society, and you may not be ready for what it reflects. Judge Eleanor Hayes walked in wearing her robe like armor, her face composed, her heart steady. She had seen it all. Liars, thieves, innocents, monsters. Every case was a number, every defendant a file. But that day would be different. Because behind those cold metal bars stood not just another man accused, but a piece of her past, a piece of her heart. James Anderson. The name echoed in her mind like a long-lost melody, her childhood best friend, her protector, her secret keeper, and now her defendant. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat when their eyes met. 1,000 memories came rushing back, not of courtrooms and verdicts, but of playgrounds and broken swings, laughter under summer trees, and 2 children dreaming of escape. But now, the world had done its work. She wore a black robe. He wore an orange jumpsuit. She held the gavel. He was in chains. And in that moment, something broke. Not just inside her, but inside the illusion of fairness. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. Because James, like so many black men, had grown up in the shadows of the system that now threatened to erase him. A system Eleanor had climbed, a system James had been crushed by. Somehow, it had brought them both to this cruel, silent crossroads where justice was supposed to live, but so often only power did. James Anderson. The name echoed through the cold courtroom like a ghost, unfamiliar to some, unforgettable to one. For Judge Eleanor Hayes, it was more than just a name on a docket. It was the name of the boy who used to sit beside her on the cracked stoop of her grandmother's house, eating popsicles that melted too quickly in the summer heat. Name of the boy who once stood in front of her, fists clenched, protecting her from a group of older kids who didn't like a white girls playing with boys like him. The boy who read to her by flashlight when the power went out in their neighborhood, his voice gentle, comforting, full of dreams. And now he stood before her in shackles. He didn't recognize her at first. Why would he? Life had not been kind to James. His once bright eyes were dulled, hollowed out by years of disappointment and survival. His hair, once full of proud curls, was cropped short like the system preferred. His frame was leaner, worn down by time and circumstance, but Eleanor saw him. Not just the man standing there, accused of a violent robbery, but the boy he had been. The boy the world had failed. She looked down at the file in front of her, fingers trembling ever so slightly as she turned the page. Robbery. Assault. A weapon involved. A prior conviction. The prosecutor's voice droned on, sterile and calculated, painting James as a threat to society, a repeat offender. A product of his choices, but no one in that courtroom knew who James really was. No one knew the nights he cried alone in the park because going home meant bruises. No one remembered that he used to bring Eleanor flowers he'd stolen from Mrs. Grant's garden next door, just to make her smile. Just to make her smile. No one cared that this boy had once taught her how to tie her shoelaces. To them, he was just another black man in the system. And to the system, that meant guilty until proven otherwise, if ever. As Eleanor sat there, trying to maintain the facade of objectivity, her heart screamed inside her chest. She had spent her career convincing herself that justice was blind, that the law was fair, that every person who came before her was treated with equal weight, equal voice, equal humanity. But here he was, James. Not some stranger, not a statistic, a boy who shared her childhood. And somehow they had ended up in the same room on opposite sides of power. How? She had gone to college. He had gone to jail. She had found mentors. He had found handcuffs. She had been seen. He had been searched. The world had opened its arms to her. It had turned its back on him. And it wasn't because he was less smart or less good. It was because he was born black and she was not. Eleanor remembered the first time she understood that truth. They were both 10, caught stealing candy from a gas station. The clerk had grabbed James by the collar and shouted for the police. Eleanor tried to explain it was her idea, that she had dared him, but the officer barely looked at her. Instead, he pushed James to the ground and pressed his knee into the boy's back while he cried. Eleanor's mother arrived minutes later, furious and afraid. Not for her daughter's actions, but for what being seen with James could mean. That was the last summer they spent together. She had moved away to the suburbs, private school, new friends, clean streets. James stayed behind, and the city swallowed him. Eleanor blinked back tears, forcing herself to stay present. She was a judge. She had a duty, but every part of her wanted to run from the bench and hold James, to tell him she was sorry, that she hadn't known back then what was happening, that she didn't understand how deeply unfair the world would be to him. She wanted to tell him that she had never forgotten him. And then, in the silence that followed the prosecution's statement, he looked up. Really looked. His gaze locked with hers, and for a breathless second time collapsed. He knew. She saw it in the way his jaw trembled, in the slight widening of his eyes. Recognition, confusion, pain. She was no longer the little girl who played tag with him under street lamps, but he was still the boy who had shielded her from every cruelty he could until life had turned crueler than any child should ever face. 1,000 unsaid things hung in the air. He had grown up in a world that watched black boys fail before they could dream, a world that gave up on them, then punished them for not rising. And now Eleanor was being asked to judge him, to decide if he deserved freedom. But deep inside, she knew what the system didn't. James had been judged long before he ever stood trial. He had been judged when he was born into a broken home. Judged when he walked to school through police stops and sirens. Judged when teachers ignored him. Judged when he got caught for things white boys got warnings for. Judged when he dared to survive. The courtroom remained still, But inside Eleanor's soul, a storm was gathering. She wasn't just looking at a case file. She was looking at a legacy of injustice, generations deep, bleeding into the life of a boy she had once loved like a brother. How could she pretend this was just another trial? James stood in silence as his public defender asked for bail. The request was denied. "Too risky," said the prosecutor. "Too unpredictable." James didn't flinch. He'd heard it all before. But Eleanor saw it, that flicker of hurt, quickly buried. It was the same hurt she remembered from when his father forgot his birthday, or when he wasn't picked for the basketball team because his attitude was too aggressive. The same story, just in a bigger room with colder walls. And as James was led away in cuffs, she remained frozen on the bench. Her robe felt heavier than ever, no longer a symbol of justice, but of betrayal. She had risen. He had fallen, and somewhere along the way, the road between them had become a fault line neither could cross. Not yet, but something in her had begun to shift. Because Eleanor Hayes had always believed in justice, and now for the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe in truth. The prosecution began with confidence, the kind of certainty that comes not from absolute truth, but from years of knowing exactly how the system works and who it works for. James Anderson, they said, was a repeat offender, a man with a past, a man with a pattern, a man with a pattern, a man caught red-handed at the scene. There was a fingerprint on the glass door, a witness who had seen everything, surveillance footage that showed someone of similar build and clothing fleeing just after the incident. The narrative was airtight, the delivery clinical, and the tone unshakably detached. The assistant district attorney didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the accusation did that for him. To the jurors, James wasn't James. He was a silhouette of every dangerous black man they'd ever seen paraded across their televisions, and the prosecutor didn't have to say the words. They were built into the structure of the system, and James stood in it like he had stood in every room, his whole life, with quiet restraint, with a fear buried too deep to show on his face, and with the haunted knowledge that his story was never really his to tell. So, as the evidence was presented, Eleanor sat silently in her chambers watching the trial on the closed-circuit screen. She'd done what the law required, recused herself to avoid the conflict of interest, but nothing about what she was watching felt neutral. She wasn't just witnessing a trial. She was watching a slow erosion of someone she once knew better than anyone. She watched the footage again and again, and though it was grainy, distorted and vague, it didn't feel like him. The body language was wrong, the gait, the posture, but none of that mattered in a courtroom. What mattered were impressions, and James, sitting there in a wrinkled shirt with tired eyes, looked guilty enough for people who already believed he was. The public defender, an overworked young woman barely 2 years out of law school, tried to fight back. She pointed out the inconsistencies. The fact that the witness hadn't seen the suspect's face clearly, that the camera footage never showed an actual weapon, that James had told the police he'd been near the store but had no reason to run. He said he heard shouting and left. He was trying to avoid trouble, not cause it. But her words fell flat in the courtroom. Eleanor could feel it through the screen. The jury wasn't listening. Not really. What stuck in their minds was the prior, a previous conviction, possession of stolen goods. Years ago, nothing violent, but enough to plant a seed. Enough to remind them that James wasn't starting from innocence. He was climbing out of a hole, and the prosecution kept shoveling dirt. And what a world it was, Eleanor thought. where one mistake at 19 could follow you like a shadow forever. But for some people, mistakes were considered character building. She had gone to school with white boys who sold pills out of their dorm rooms. They got community service and second chances. James had been caught with someone else's phone and got 2 years. 2 years that changed him, hardened him, broke him in places even she couldn't see anymore. The world never asked what led him to those moments. Never asked who failed him before he failed himself. Never asked how many doors were closed before he stopped knocking. The world looked at him and saw a decision, not a context, a crime, not a life. Eleanor remembered the neighborhood they grew up in. Cracked sidewalks, rusting street signs, sirens as common as birdsong. Her mother had always said, "It's only temporary. We'll get out." And they did. Her father's job transferred. They moved to a cleaner suburb with green lawns and quiet nights. But James stayed in the place where temporary became permanent for so many. Stayed where teachers were too exhausted to notice brilliance. Stayed where playgrounds were replaced by liquor stores and check-cashing booths. Stayed where survival meant learning to move invisibly. And still, he had survived. He had tried. Eleanor knew this because after they reconnected briefly years ago through a mutual acquaintance, she had looked him up. Quietly, out of curiosity, out of guilt, she found that he'd held 3 jobs in 5 years, a delivery driver, a janitor, a warehouse loader, all minimum wage. He had no children, no arrests since his early 20s, but also no credit, no savings, no second chances. He was not a perfect man, but he was trying in a world that punished effort when it came wrapped in black skin. Eleanor leaned forward as the prosecution brought up the fingerprint, a partial print on a shattered glass door. No confirmation of when it was placed there. No surveillance of James actually committing the crime. But it was enough to create doubt. And doubt, when you're black and in court, doesn't free you. It cages you further. It builds a case without requiring proof. It makes suggestion feel like certainty. Then came the witness, a middle-aged white woman who had been in her car across the street. She said she saw a black man in a hoodie run out of the shop around the time of the robbery. She couldn't describe his face. She hesitated when asked to confirm it was James. But still, she nodded, eyes flickering toward the prosecution as if seeking approval. "I think it was him," she said. He looked like the kind of guy. The courtroom went quiet. That sentence hung in the air like smog. The kind of guy. No one objected, but Eleanor flinched. It was that sentence, spoken so casually, so confidently, that struck her like a slap. Because what kind of guy was James? The kind of guy who gave her half of his sandwich when she forgot her lunch? The kind of guy who tried to read To Kill a Mockingbird with her, even though he struggled with the big words? The kind of guy who once cried when they found a dead bird in the street? That kind? Or did she mean the kind of guy juries had been taught to fear? The kind of guy white women clutched their purses around? The kind of guy the system didn't ask questions about, just processed? James sat motionless as the woman spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just looked down at his hands, hands that had known too many locked doors and not enough open ones. The defense tried again. They showed character letters from former employers. They brought up his clean record in recent years. They asked the judge to consider that James had turned up voluntarily for questioning, had cooperated, had never tried to flee. But none of it carried the weight of that one half-seen fingerprint and that One shaky sentence from a woman who had never met him before. It didn't matter that he had walked into the station on his own. It didn't matter that he had no history of violence. It didn't matter that he had said he was just passing by, that he had heard glass break and didn't want to get involved. He had been there, and that was enough. And as Eleanor sat behind the safety of a private screen, watching it all unfold, something inside her grew unbearably heavy. Because she had worn the robe of justice for over a decade, had read out sentences, had believed in due process, had trusted the system. But now she saw it, how all the pieces conspired before a word was even spoken. The color of the defendant's skin, the timbre of his voice, the way he dressed, the fear in the jury's eyes, the casual cruelty of bureaucracy, and in the middle of it all, James. The boy who once walked her home when it got dark. The boy who had no one walking with him now. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the defense prepared to make its final attempt to humanize James in front of the jury. A jury that had barely looked at him the entire trial. 12 people, mostly white, 2 black jurors who had remained silent and tight-lipped throughout deliberations. Eleanor watched them closely from her private viewing screen, picking up the smallest cues. The way some leaned away from James whenever the defense referenced his upbringing, the eye rolls when systemic racism was mentioned, the board sighs when the public defender spoke about a context. It was clear this trial had never truly been about evidence. It was about perception, fear, memory, history. The public defender, a young woman named Naomi Grant, stood in the center of the courtroom, her voice firm but trembling slightly. She had stayed up all night. That much was obvious. Her notes were crumpled, her blazer wrinkled, her face drawn with fatigue. But in her eyes was fire, a rage that couldn't quite be hidden beneath courtroom decorum. She looked directly at the jury, then at the judge, and then finally at James. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began. You've heard the evidence. You've seen the footage. You've listened to the testimony. But let's not pretend this was ever just about a broken door and a missing wallet. Let's talk about what's really on trial here. The prosecutor rose, objecting. Your Honor, she's making a political argument. Overruled, the judge said quietly. Naomi turned back to the jury. This man, James Anderson, is not a monster. He's not a stereotype. He's not some shadowy figure in a hoodie like we've been told to fear. He's a person, a human being, a son, a human being, a son, a friend, someone who has tried again and again to live within a system that was never designed for him to survive, let alone succeed in. I've spoken to the counselor who saw him every week when he came out of prison the first time. I've looked him in the eyes when he told me that no matter what happens in this courtroom, he refuses to stop believing he's worth more than what this world has told him. James's face didn't move. He looked down at the table, shoulders hunched, jaw clenched. Naomi continued, her voice softer now. I won't stand here and tell you James is perfect. He's not. None of us are. But perfection is not the standard for justice. Fairness is. Equity is. And if we're truly being honest with ourselves, if James Anderson looked different, if he were white, dressed in a college sweatshirt, came from a family with money, do you honestly think we'd be sitting here right now? Do you really believe the police would have brought him in with this little evidence, this vague of a witness statement, this inconclusive footage? Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's stomach twisted, not because Naomi was wrong, but because she was absolutely, heartbreakingly right. "Want you to ask yourselves," Naomi said, stepping closer to the jury box. "What's really guiding your judgment here? Is it the facts, or is it a feeling? A suspicion? A story you've been told over and over about who belongs in a cage and who deserves compassion?" She paused and then turned slowly toward James. Her voice broke slightly when she spoke again. "You don't know him like I do. You don't know that he showed up to every meeting early. You don't know that he cried when he talked about missing his sister's funeral because he was incarcerated. You don't know that the reason he was near that store was because he was applying for a job at the corner diner, trying to turn something around in a world that never even gave him a straight road to walk on." Naomi stepped back. "You have the power to decide whether James Anderson continues to be defined by fear, by history, by a single moment, or whether you can look at him and see not what society tells you, but who he really is." The courtroom remained quiet as she sat down. There was no thunderous applause, no sweeping dramatic moment, but something in the air had changed, just slightly. Eleanor felt it, a subtle current, and yet she also felt something else, the deep, cruel inevitability that hung over trials like this, like a storm that never quite passed. And then it was time for the prosecution's closing. The assistant arose with a rehearsed calmness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He didn't need to. He smiled politely, thanked the jury, and proceeded to dismantle every piece of Naomi's speech, not by proving facts, but by questioning character. "Yes," he said, "we feel for Mr. Anderson. We acknowledge his difficult past. But this isn't about past struggles. It's about present danger. This is about a man who was at the scene of the crime, a man with a previous conviction, a man whose fingerprint was on the door, a man whose appearance matches the witness's description." He paused and then leaned forward, his voice almost gentle. "This isn't about race. This isn't about history. This is about responsibility, and the responsibility lies with the man who chose to be there, the man who ran, the man who never offered another explanation. He didn't have to say it, but the message was clear. Don't feel too much. Don't think too hard. Just trust what you already believe." And that, Eleanor realized with a deep ache, was the weapon most powerful in these cases. Not the law, not the facts, but the familiar story, the one jurors had been taught all their lives. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Eleanor stood by the window in her private office, her hands pressed to the cold glass. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing sacred was happening inside the courthouse. People rushed for lunch, answered phones, honked horns. But in that jury room, a man's life was being decided by 12 people who had never walked his streets, never lived his fears, never learned to carry the burden of being both invisible and overexposed at the same time. She thought about their childhood again, how James had once gotten caught climbing over the fence to retrieve her ball. The old white man who owned the yard had come out screaming, waving a rake like a weapon. James had frozen. He was 11. Eleanor remembered how she had yelled, "It was my fault." And how the man had looked at her, then back at James, then walked away, muttering something about a troublemaker's. Even then, the message was clear. She could be forgiven. He could not. And that truth had only deepened over time. James had been trying to hold his life together with borrowed threads. Jobs that barely paid enough to live. A probation system that treated him like a ticking time bomb. Constant background checks that disqualified him from opportunities before he could explain himself. He had no credit score, no family safety net, no one to call when the rent came due early, or the bus stopped running, or the power went out. He had shown up anyway. He had tried. But the system doesn't see trying. Not from people like him. In her office, Eleanor walked over to her old filing cabinet and pulled out a small, worn box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were scraps of her childhood, photographs, letters, and at the very bottom, a folded note written in crooked, boyish handwriting. From James. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. Ali, thanks for always being nice to me. I know I don't talk a lot, but I think you're the best person I know. I hope we can always be friends, even when we grow up. I'll never forget you. She read it again and again, the words blurred with tears. She had forgotten, not the boy, but the bond. The debt. The way she had been lifted while he had been dragged down. In the courtroom below, the jury had returned. The courtroom doors creaked open slowly as the jury filed back in, one by one, their expressions unreadable, flat, guarded, practiced. The air shifted. It was the kind of silence that wraps around the room like a noose, tightening with every second, crushing even the smallest hope into something fragile and brittle. James didn't move. He sat exactly as he had for days, hands clasped together on the defense table, eyes fixed not on the jury, not on the judge, not on anyone, just down. As if he already knew, as if something deep inside him had whispered the ending long before the story had begun. Eleanor stood in the back, pressed into the shadows, where she was allowed to observe but not interfere. Every muscle in her body ached to speak, to scream, to tear through the walls of impartiality that her robe demanded of her. But she could only watch. Watch the system she had sworn to uphold deliver its decision. One more time, on a man who never stood a chance against its machinery. The foreman, an older white man in a navy blazer, stood up. He unfolded the paper with careful fingers, like it might explode in his hands. Oh, we, the jury, find the defendant, James Anderson, guilty. The words fell like stones. James didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He just closed his eyes, slowly, like he was shutting out the last bit of light the world had offered him. His attorney gasped quietly, and Naomi reached for his arm, her hand trembling. The bailiff stepped closer. Eleanor couldn't breathe. There was no outburst, no chaos, just silence. A silence louder than any scream. A silence that carried centuries. A silence filled with the weight of every black man who had sat in that same seat, beneath that same flag, in front of that same gaze, and heard the same word, guilty. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them. The courtroom slowly emptied, people shuffling out, eyes low, some whispering, most just relieved that it was over. For them, it was just another Tuesday, just another case closed. But for James, this was the end of something, not just freedom, but faith. The last thread of belief that maybe, just maybe, he could be seen as something more than a file number and a face in a mugshot. Eleanor remained frozen. Her mind reeled with everything she had witnessed. The circumstantial evidence, the shaky testimony, the bias that had hung over the trial like a cloud. And above all, the fact that she knew he hadn't done it. Maybe not with evidence, but with something deeper. A knowing born not just from friendship, but from truth. James didn't run that day. He ran his whole life. From poverty, from pain, from the assumptions that walked into every room before he did. He didn't steal. But now, the system had stolen from him, again. Naomi stood beside him, whispering something in his ear. But he didn't answer. His stare was blank, defeated. The kind of defeat that doesn't shout or sob, but settles like dust on old wounds. He didn't ask why. Because he already knew. He'd always known reason known. The bailiff approached, motioning to cuff him. James stood slowly. No resistance. No final words. Just a slight nod to Naomi, as if to say thank you for trying, even when trying had never been enough. As he was led away, Eleanor turned, walked quickly through the side corridor, down the long, empty hallway. Her heels clicked against the tile, echoing like gunshots in the stillness. She pushed open a side door and stepped into the stairwell, pressing her back against the wall, letting the cold concrete seep into her spine. She didn't cry. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come later, in the dark, when no one was watching, because what had just happened wasn't just. It was history repeating itself in perfect, cruel rhythm. Another black man condemned, not for what he did, but for who he was allowed to be. Another life reduced to evidence that never really proved anything. Another name that would fade into the records, into the walls of a cell, into silence. And she had watched it happen, powerless. And James had known from the moment he walked into that courtroom, not because he was guilty, but because he had always been told, subtly, violently, constantly, that the system wasn't built for men like him to survive. And today, it proved itself right. Fair. So, in the days that followed the verdict, Eleanor found herself waking in the middle of the night, breath shallow, heart pounding, haunted not by the law she upheld, but by the silence she had kept. Everywhere she turned, she saw James, not the man in the courtroom, but the boy who used to walk beside her after school, who carried her books when her arm was in a sling, who once took the blame when they broke a neighbor's window. The boy who had loved her without question, even when the world started to treat them differently. The guilt was unbearable, not just for not speaking, but for benefiting from the same system that had swallowed him whole. She sat alone in her chambers, staring at the file marked State versus James Anderson. Each page felt like a betrayal. The inconsistencies, the rushed police report, the missing surveillance footage from across the street. She saw the holes, and yet none of it had mattered. Not to the jury, and not to the jury. Not to the system. Not when the accused was black and poor, and already marked by his past. James was never presumed innocent. He was simply waiting to be found guilty. Eleanor's hands trembled as she traced his name at the top of the file, knowing that the law she had built her life around had failed him. Not by accident, but by design. And she had sat at the center of it, robed in authority, and said nothing. The prison walls stood tall and gray like monuments to a forgotten promise. A promise of reform, of justice, of second chances, lies, all of them. When Eleanor walked through the gates of the correctional facility for the first time in 15 years, her heart was a clenched fist. The heavy door slammed behind her with a finality that made her flinch, though she didn't show it. She'd come to see James, not as a judge, not as an official visitor, just Eleanor. A woman riddled with guilt, years too late, desperate to look a man in the eyes and ask for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. She was led through fluorescent-lit hallways that smelled of bleach and stale air. Every face she passed bore the same quiet resignation. Men in orange jumpsuits, most of them black and brown, shoulders slouched not from defeat, but from knowing this world never gave them a fair chance in the first place. The guard escorting her didn't say much. Just pointed to the visiting room with a grunt and nodded. James was already seated when she entered. He didn't rise. Not because she thought she could save James. She didn't know if that was still possible, but because his story had become the lens through which she saw everything else. Every case, every file, every young man brought into her court reminded her that justice was not a scale, it was a battlefield. And she could no longer play referee in a war that was never fair. Late one evening, long after court had adjourned, she sat in her chambers surrounded by files. The fluorescent light buzzed softly overhead as she reviewed a new motion someone had submitted pro bono on James's behalf. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't overturn anything. But it was something. A start. Her fingers traced the margins, her thoughts drifting to the look in his eyes during their prison visit. Worn, but not extinguished. There was still a flicker there. And maybe, if enough people cared, if enough people refused to look away, that flicker could become a flame. She remembered his words, "Don't cry for me, fight for the next one." And that's what she intended to do. Not from a place of guilt anymore, but from clarity. Because if James had taught her anything, it was that justice should not be measured by rules followed or procedures upheld. It should be measured by who walks away free and who doesn't, who gets a second chance and who gets forgotten, who is believed, who is seen. Who is seen? And far too often, it wasn't boys like James. Months had passed since Eleanor last saw James. The memory of their visit still sat like a stone in her chest, his voice echoing through her conscience, his words branding her every waking thought. She tried to return to routine, but the courtroom no longer felt like hers. Every case reminded her of him. Every young black man who stood before her shackled and wary reminded her of what she had allowed to happen, and worse, what the world kept allowing over and over again. There were too many like James, too many whose lives were reduced to docket numbers, mugshots and cold case files, whose truths were buried under the weight of assumptions and unchallenged power. Justice, in its purest form, felt like a myth people told themselves, so they could sleep at night. She spent her evenings combing through documents from James's trial, evidence dismissed, testimonies ignored, bias left unquestioned. She revisited court transcripts and found herself underlining questions she should have asked, objections she should have raised. It was too late for regrets, but not too late for the truth. Eleanor began compiling everything. Overlooked evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, expert opinions that had been denied admission in court. She partnered with a young civil rights attorney named Naomi Reed, sharp, relentless, and unafraid to speak in the language of revolution. Together, they worked in quiet urgency, filing new motions and gathering statements that had once been silenced by fear. In those long hours, Eleanor found herself relearning the law through the lens of those it had harmed. Naomi introduced her to activists, exonerees, and public defenders who had lived with injustice, not just studied it. One man, wrongly imprisoned for 22 years, told Eleanor, "A prison didn't steal my freedom. It taught me how little anyone cared that I lost it." His words seared into her like acid. James wasn't just a case. He was part of a pattern. A pattern sustained by good people doing nothing, by powerful people staying silent, and by people like Eleanor, who had all the right intentions but no courage when it counted most. Naomi warned her that the new motion they were preparing might not go far. The appeals courts rarely entertained cases they considered closed. But Eleanor didn't flinch. They weren't just filing for James's sake. They were building something larger, a public narrative, a storm of awareness. Eleanor reached out to journalists and agreed to go on record. She gave interviews not as Judge Eleanor Hayes, but as a former judge who had failed to protect the innocent. Her admissions sparked firestorms in the media. Some called her brave, others called her a traitor to her profession. The backlash was swift. She received threats. Colleagues turned their backs. Mentors cut ties. But for the first time in years, she felt honest. In one televised interview, she looked straight into the camera and said, James Anderson was not a mistake. The system did not accidentally fail him. It functioned exactly as it was built to. And I was part of it. That moment went viral, and with it came a surge of public interest, not just in James's case, but in how many others were like it. Eleanor had opened a wound the justice system had worked hard to keep hidden. She had exposed not just one injustice, but a legacy. She visited James again. This time, he looked different. He had heard the news. His lawyer had visited. He didn't smile, but there was something in his posture, less guarded, less resigned. We were really doing this, he said. I have to, she replied. You don't owe me anything. Yeah, I owe the truth everything, she said. And I owe that little boy I used to walk home from school more than silence. James stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't offer forgiveness, but he didn't turn away. In the weeks that followed, the motion for retrial gained traction. The DA office, under public scrutiny, began reviewing the case. It was an unprecedented move. Prosecutors were not known for revisiting convictions, especially ones that had stood for over a decade. But this time, they were under a spotlight, and they knew it. When the hearing for the retrial was scheduled, Eleanor sat in the back of the courtroom. She was no longer the one on the bench. She was simply a witness to the unraveling of something long buried. Naomi stood at the front, fierce and composed, arguing not just the technical failures of the original trial, but the deeper, systemic forces that had led to James's conviction. She spoke of racial profiling, prosecutorial negligence, coerced witness statements, and the deliberate exclusion of exculpatory evidence. She held up each piece like a mirror and forced the court to look. The new judge listened carefully. There was tension in the air, press, protesters, activists lining the halls. And through it all, James sat silent, his eyes never leaving the front. He didn't flinch when they read out the original sentence. He didn't react when the judge said they would take the motion under review. But Eleanor saw the flicker again, the one that had never quite died. Hope, fragile but alive. Outside, the crowd chanted his name. It wasn't just about James anymore. He had become a symbol, a man whose life had been crushed by a machine that pretended to be blind, a man whose innocence was overshadowed by skin color, by background, by bias masked as procedure. Eleanor watched from the steps of the courthouse, tears welling in her eyes. Not for herself, and not just for James, but for all the names she'd never known, for every boy who never got a second chance, and every girl who lost a brother to chains wrapped in law books. She knew they weren't done. This was one case, one fight, but it was a beginning. And this time, she would not sit silently in the dark. The morning of the final ruling arrived, heavy with anticipation. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Dozens of supporters had gathered, holding hand-painted signs bearing James's name alongside words like "a justice delayed is justice denied," and "innocence shouldn't expire." Reporters lined the steps with cameras already rolling, broadcasting the scene to a nation that had been following every twist of this extraordinary case. Eleanor arrived early. dressed not in her judge's robe, but in simple black, quiet, understated, purposeful. She slipped inside before the crowd surged, taking a place in the back of the gallery, hidden by shadow but not shame. Her hands trembled slightly, though her face remained composed. This was a day for truth, not control. She had spent enough years masking what she felt. James was led in through a side door, his hands shackled as they always were, but his head high. The chains looked out of place now, an outdated costume for a man who had already endured so much. Naomi walked beside him, carrying files and hope, her expression unreadable, but her resolve unshaken. James glanced briefly at the gallery, and though he didn't spot Eleanor, she saw him, and it was enough. His face bore the quiet dignity of someone who had stopped begging for freedom and started claiming it instead. The judge entered, and silence fell. The room, so often indifferent, now felt alive, every breath held, every gaze fixed. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. The judge, a woman of few words, began reading from the bench. Her voice was firm, deliberate, without embellishment. She spoke of evidence suppressed, of witness testimonies coerced and mishandled. She acknowledged the systemic flaws that had plagued James's original trial, the racial bias that had been ignored, the prosecutorial misconduct that had been hand-waved as strategy, and the failure of the court itself to uphold its responsibility to truth over expedience. She paused, then looked at James directly before continuing. The words that followed changed everything. The conviction was vacated. James Anderson was no longer a prisoner of the state. He was finally and officially a free man. Gasps rippled through the room. A sob broke out from somewhere in the back. James closed his eyes for a long moment, as if needing time to believe what he'd just heard. Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. The judge's gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in emotional release. Supporters embraced. Strangers cried together. Even seasoned journalists wiped away tears as they relayed the moment lived to millions. James didn't speak. He simply stood, motionless, tears sliding down his cheeks, his chest rising and falling with quiet disbelief. Outside, the crowd swelled. When James emerged into the daylight, no longer wearing the number that had defined him for years, a wave of cheers greeted him. Cameras flashed. Microphones were pushed forward. Reporters shouted questions, but James didn't rush to the podium. He walked slowly, deliberately, through the crowd, breathing it all in. The sun on his face, the wind on his skin, the feeling of ground underfoot that wasn't surrounded by razor wire and concrete walls. Each step was a reclamation, not just of freedom, but of identity, of humanity. Eleanor remained by the entrance, watching from a distance. When their eyes finally met, the world around them seemed to blur into silence. No words were spoken. She nodded. He nodded back. And in that silent exchange, decades of history passed between them. The playground laughter, the lost time, the betrayal, the wound, and finally, the fragile thread of something like peace. Later that evening, a press conference was held. James stood beside Naomi, flanked by his legal team and several civil rights leaders. The room was packed, buzzing with anticipation. When he stepped to the microphone, the room quieted instantly. He paused, looked out at the sea of faces, and began to speak. "You was 17 when they took me," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I was just a kid. I didn't have a record. I didn't even understand what was happening until the cell door closed behind me. They told me the system would be fair." that if I was innocent, I'd go home. But the truth is, it was never built for me. It wasn't built for boys who look like me. He talked about the lost years, the death of his mother while he was incarcerated, the time he spent watching his peers build lives while he sat in a cage, stripped of dignity and agency. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. But with every word, the weight of injustice was laid bare for all to see. They called me a criminal, but I was a student. I had dreams. I had dreams. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to give back to my neighborhood. I wanted to make my mother proud. Instead, I became another number, another headline, another file in a cabinet that no one wanted to open. The room was silent, but for the sound of quiet sobs. Reporters lowered their cameras. Lawyers wiped their eyes. Even the most seasoned among them couldn't remain unmoved. James continued, I don't want pity. I want change. I want us to look at every courtroom, every cop, every judge and ask, who are we protecting? Who are we failing? And what are we willing to do to fix it? He stepped back, and the room exploded with applause, not of celebration, but of solidarity. He had not just spoken his truth. He had held up a mirror to a nation in denial. In the days that followed, the story dominated headlines. Op-eds were written, panel discussions aired, protests reignited with new vigor. James became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resistance. Proof that even in the face of staggering injustice, dignity could endure. Eleanor declined most interviews. She didn't want the spotlight. She had played her part, both in the injustice and, however late, in its undoing. She spent her days helping Naomi and others push for legislation, advocating for sentence reviews, for prosecutorial accountability, for mandatory bias training in every courtroom. It was slow work, frustrating work, but it was the only kind that mattered now. And as the sun set on that long, monumental day, the city seemed to exhale, not because the fight was over, but because, for once, truth had won. And somewhere, in the midst of a cheering crowd and flashing cameras, a man who had once been a forgotten boy stood tall, not broken, not bitter, but burning with a light the system had tried so hard to extinguish. And so we arrive at the end, but not the kind that offers comfort. Because what began as a chance courtroom encounter between a judge and her childhood friend revealed far more than a personal tragedy. It unearthed a truth many still refuse to confront, that the justice system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was built to. Not for everyone. Not equally. And certainly not for people who look like James. Judge Eleanor Hayes' journey from silent complicity to painful accountability wasn't heroic. It was necessary. Her transformation forced her, and all of us, to stare at the insidious normalcy of injustice. Through every twist, every courtroom tear, and every long, sleepless night, we saw the brutal cost of a system that punishes identity more than action, history more than evidence. James Anderson's story isn't singular. He is one among thousands, millions, who have been pushed to the judicial meat grinder and left to rot in cells while the world spins on, indifferent. But by the end, we saw a different kind of verdict. One that wasn't just handed down by a judge, but shouted by a community, carried by resilience, and forged through pain. It was a call to action, a call to remember, a call to never again look away. This story was never just about James or Eleanor. It was about the lies that hold power in place and the cost of telling the truth when it's no longer convenient. It was about the quiet courage it takes to stand up, Not when it's easy, but when it's too late. Because sometimes the only way to write a new ending is to finally speak the truth about the beginning. This was A1 Storyteller, where stories are not just told, but felt. If this story moved you, shook you, or made you question the world a little deeper, then don't look away. Like, share, comment, and subscribe, because the next story might just be your own.